The desert wasn't just hot that day, it was alive, breathing like a predator waiting for something to break, something to die. And somewhere beneath the endless waves of burning sand, something already had. The air shimmered like broken glass, distorting the horizon, making it impossible to tell where the world ended and the sky began. And in the middle of that silent, suffocating wasteland, a single figure dragged himself forward inch by inch, his uniform torn, his skin burned raw, his breath shallow and uneven like it could vanish at any second, and behind him, leaving a second trail that cut across the sand like a scar, was the German shepherd who refused to leave him. Hours earlier, the mission had been simple. Too simple. The kind of mission that made experienced men uneasy. The kind that whispered something was wrong long before the first shot was fired. But orders didn't care about instinct, and neither did war. So they had moved in before sunrise. A small unit slipping through the desert shadows, their boots silent against the sand, their breaths controlled. Their minds focused on one objective hidden somewhere beneath the barren earth. A suspected weapons cache buried deep enough to avoid detection, guarded by silence and secrecy rather than visible defenses, and that was what made it dangerous. The dog had sensed it first. Not fear, not exactly, but something deeper, something ancient, the kind of instinct that didn't come from training but from survival, from generations of creatures that had learned how to feel death before it arrived. And as the team approached the target zone, the German shepherd's ears twitched, his body stiffened, his pace slowed, and for a brief moment, he turned his head, not toward the mission, but toward the man beside him, locking eyes with a look that didn't belong in a battlefield, a look that felt almost human, like a warning that couldn't be spoken. But they kept moving. And then the ground exploded. It wasn't loud at first, just a sudden shift, a violent tremor beneath their boots, like the desert itself had decided to rise up and swallow them whole. And then came the blast, tearing through the silence with a force that turned air into fire and sand into shrapnel, throwing bodies in every direction, ripping apart everything that had been certain just seconds before. And in the chaos, there was no time to think, no time to react, only time to survive. When the dust settled, nothing was where it was supposed to be. The world had become a blur of heat and pain, of ringing ears and choking lungs, and somewhere in that shattered silence, the man tried to move, but his body refused, his leg trapped beneath something heavy, something sharp digging into his flesh, and for a moment, all he could do was breathe, slow and painful, trying to understand what was left of him, what was gone, and whether he was still alive. That's when he felt it. A presence. Not enemy. Not danger. Something else. Through the haze of dust and sunlight, a shape emerged, low, steady, moving with purpose, and then the dog was there, pushing through debris, ignoring the heat, ignoring the danger, his paws bleeding, his breath harsh but determined, and without hesitation, he reached the man, nudging his face, licking the blood from his cheek as if trying to remind him that he wasn't alone, that he wasn't finished. The man tried to speak, but no words came. Only a broken breath. And the dog understood. He didn't panic. He didn't hesitate. He began to dig. The sand was still hot from the explosion, burning against his paws, but he kept going, clawing at the debris that pinned the man down, pulling away pieces one by one, his movements frantic but focused, driven by something stronger than training, something that didn't need commands, something that only existed between them, a bond forged not just through missions, but through silence, through moments that no one else had ever seen. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. Time had stopped meaning anything. But eventually, the weight lifted. The man gasped as pressure released from his leg, pain shooting through his body like fire, but he was free, barely, broken, but alive, and before he could even process it, the dog was already moving again, circling him, scanning the horizon, alert, protective, ready for whatever came next. because something was still wrong. The silence wasn't normal. There were no voices, no movement, no backup. Just the wind, and the heat, and the realization that they were completely alone. The radio was gone. The team, nowhere to be seen. And the desert endless. The man forced himself to sit up, every movement a battle against pain, his vision blurring, his hands shaking as he tried to focus, tried to remember the mission, the coordinates, anything that could guide them out of this nightmare. But nothing made sense anymore. Nothing except the fact that if they stayed here, they would die. He looked at the dog. The dog looked back. And in that moment, no words were needed. Because somehow, they both knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. And far beyond the heat, beyond the broken horizon, something was watching, waiting, and moving closer with every second they wasted standing still. The desert had taken everything from them. But it wasn't done yet. And neither were they. The sun had climbed higher now, turning the desert into something merciless, something that didn't just exist around them, but pressed down on them from every direction, suffocating, relentless, and unforgiving, and every breath the man took felt heavier than the last, thick with heat and dust, scratching his throat as if the air itself had turned against him. But he forced himself to move anyway because staying still meant death, and he knew it, even through the haze of pain clouding his mind. Even through the dizziness that made the world tilt slightly every time he tried to focus, and beside him, the German shepherd stayed close, not running ahead, not wandering, but matching every slow, uneven step as if he understood that this wasn't just movement, this was survival measured 1 second at a time. His leg wasn't right, he could feel that with every shift of weight, something deep inside it grinding wrong, sharp and unstable, and when he looked down, the sight confirmed what his body already knew, the fabric torn open, blood dried in dark patches against his skin, swelling already forming beneath the surface, and he knew if he didn't keep it moving, didn't force it to work, it would lock up completely, and then it would be over. Not just for him, but for both of them, because the dog wouldn't leave. He had already proven that, and that truth sat heavier on him than the pain itself. The silence stretched around them, endless and unnatural, broken only by the crunch of sand beneath their steps and the faint, distant whisper of wind shifting across the dunes, and it wasn't just empty, it felt wrong, like something had been erased, like the world had decided to forget this place entirely, and somewhere deep in his instincts, something whispered that the explosion hadn't just been an accident, that the simplicity of the mission had been a lie from the beginning, but there was no time to think about that now, no time to question anything except how far they could go before his body gave out. The dog stopped suddenly. Not a hesitation, not confusion, but a full stop, his body rigid, ears forward, eyes locked on something far ahead that the man couldn't yet see, and instantly, the man felt it too, that shift in the air, that invisible tension that tightened everything at once, and he followed the dog's gaze, squinting through the shimmering heat until the shapes began to form, faint at first, barely more than shadows against the horizon, but slowly becoming clearer with each passing second. Vehicles. Not friendly. They moved slowly, deliberately, cutting across the desert in a wide arc, like predators circling something wounded, and even from this distance, the intent was obvious. They weren't searching blindly, they were tracking, sweeping the area methodically, and the realization hit hard and fast. Whoever had set that trap wasn't finished, and now they were making sure no one walked away from it. The man's heart pounded harder, not from fear alone, but from the sudden surge of adrenaline that cut through the exhaustion, forcing clarity into his mind whether he wanted it or not, and he dropped low, pulling himself down behind a slight ridge of sand that barely offered any cover, his breathing shallow as he tried to steady himself, while the dog moved instantly, silently lowering beside him, his body pressed close, his presence solid and unwavering. They couldn't outrun vehicles. Not like this. not with his leg. And staying here meant being found. The man scanned the terrain, forcing his eyes to focus, searching for anything, any advantage, any chance that wasn't already slipping through his fingers, and then he saw it, barely visible through the distortion of heat, a jagged line in the distance where the sand broke into rock, uneven and sharp, offering shadows, offering cover, and maybe, just maybe, offering a way to disappear. It was far. Too far. But it was the only option. He looked at the dog again, and once more, there was no need for words, because the dog had already shifted his stance, already leaning forward slightly, ready, alert, waiting for the signal that they both knew was coming, and for a brief second, something passed between them that went beyond survival, beyond training, something deeper, something that felt like trust built not in moments like this, but in everything that had led to it. Then they moved. Slow at first, careful, staying low, using every small dip in the sand to hide their movement, every shadow to break their outline, but even with that, every step felt exposed, every second stretched thin with the knowledge that at any moment, someone out there could look in the right direction, and it would all be over, and the man pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain screaming through his leg, ignoring the dizziness creeping in at the edges of his vision, because stopping wasn't an option anymore. Behind them, the vehicle shifted. Not random. Not wandering. Adjusting. Closing in. The man felt it before he fully saw it, that subtle change of direction, that tightening circle, and a cold realization settled deep in his chest. They had been spotted, maybe not clearly, maybe not confirmed, but enough to draw attention, enough to turn a search into a pursuit, and suddenly the distance to the rocks didn't feel far, it felt impossible. But the dog didn't slow down. If anything, he moved faster, glancing back once, just once, his eyes sharp, focused, almost commanding, and something about that look pushed the man forward again, forced his body to keep going when it wanted to collapse, when every muscle screamed to stop, and he followed, step after painful step, dragging himself through the burning sand as the world narrowed down to one single objective. Reach the rocks. Or die here. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it a faint sound that didn't belong to the desert, a distant hum, growing louder, more distinct, and the man's stomach tightened as he recognized it. Engines, closer now, faster than before, no longer circling but approaching directly, and the urgency snapped into something sharp and immediate, something that erased hesitation completely. They were out of time. The rocks loomed closer now, no longer a distant hope, but a reachable reality, their jagged edges casting thin shadows that stretched across the sand like lifelines, and the man pushed harder, stumbling once, catching himself barely before he hit the ground, his vision blurring, his breath ragged and uneven, but still moving, still forcing himself forward because stopping now meant everything the dog had done, everything they had survived, would mean nothing. The dog reached the edge first. He didn't stop. He turned immediately, moving back toward the man, nudging him, guiding him, almost pulling him the last few steps until finally, they crossed into the narrow strip of shadow, collapsing behind the rough stone as the heat seemed to ease just enough to feel like a difference, just enough to remind them that they were still alive. But there was no relief, because the sound of engines didn't fade. It grew louder, closer. And somewhere beyond the rocks, just out of sight, tires pressed into sand, doors opened, and voices, low, sharp, deliberate, cut through the silence. They had arrived. And this time, they weren't searching anymore. The moment the engines went silent, the desert seemed to hold its breath, as if even the wind knew that something final was about to unfold, and pressed against the rough edge of the rock, the man fought to steady his breathing, each inhale shallow, each exhale controlled, because even the smallest sound could betray them now, and beside him, the German shepherd didn't move at all, his body low, muscles tight. eyes locked toward the direction of the voices that had just broken the silence, his ears twitching with microscopic precision, catching every shift, every footstep, every faint scrape of movement against sand, and the intensity in him wasn't panic, it was calculation, instinct sharpened into something almost surgical. Boots crunched closer. Slow, deliberate, not rushed. Whoever they weren't worried about being attacked, they weren't expecting resistance, and that confidence sent a cold, heavy weight through the man's chest because it meant one thing. They believed everyone was already dead. A voice cut through the air, low and controlled, speaking in a language the man didn't fully understand, but tone didn't need translation. It carried intent, sharp, methodical, issuing instructions, dividing the search into sectors, and then came the sound of metal shifting, weapons being readied, safety clicks echoing in the open air like distant thunder, and the man pressed himself deeper into the rock, trying to become smaller, invisible, something the desert could swallow whole. The dog shifted slightly. Not a mistake, not a noise, just a subtle adjustment, his head lowering even further, his body angling toward the narrow gap between two jagged stones where a sliver of sunlight cut through, illuminating a thin strip of sand beyond, and the man followed his gaze carefully, inching just enough to see what the dog saw without exposing himself, and through that narrow line of sight, figures began to pass. 3 at first, then 5. Armed, scanning, moving in a slow, tightening pattern that swept across the area like a net being drawn closed, their eyes sharp, their movements practiced, and it was clear now this wasn't a random patrol, this was a cleanup operation. No survivors. No witnesses. The man's pulse pounded harder, but he forced his body to stay still, to stay silent, even as every instinct screamed to run, to fight, to do something other than lie here waiting, but he knew better, knew that any sudden movement would draw attention instantly, and with his leg the way it was, there would be no second chance, no escape, just a quick and final end. The dog's breathing was almost impossible to hear. Controlled, measured. But there was something else now, something beneath the calm, a rising tension that the man could feel through proximity alone, like the air between them had thickened, and for a brief moment, the dog turned his head again, locking eyes with him, and this time the look was different, not just warning, not just awareness, but decision. And then it happened. A shadow shifted wrong. One of the men paused. Just for a second. But it was enough. His head turned slightly, eyes narrowing toward the rock formation, not fully convinced, not certain, but curious, and curiosity in a place like this was deadly, and the man felt the moment stretch thin, fragile, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. The dog didn't wait. Before the man could even react, the German shepherd moved, not toward the threat, but away from it, slipping silently out from the shadow on the opposite side of the rocks, his body low, fast, controlled, disappearing into the open desert with just enough noise to be noticed, just enough movement to draw attention. It was deliberate. A distraction. The man's heart slammed hard against his ribs as he realized what was happening, what the dog was doing, and for a split second, instinct screamed at him to call out, to stop him, to pull him back, but no sound came, no movement followed, because deep down, he knew, this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Shouts erupted instantly. The searching men snapped toward the movement, weapons raised, voices sharp and urgent now, no longer calm, no longer controlled, and several of them broke formation, moving fast in the direction the dog had gone, chasing the fleeting shape that darted across the sand like a ghost, and in seconds, the pressure around the rock shifted, the tight circle loosening, the focus pulling away. The man lay frozen, his mind racing, torn between relief and something heavier, something that settled deep and sharp in his chest, because he understood exactly what that distraction meant, understood that the dog hadn't just drawn them away, he had taken the danger onto himself. Time stretched again. Seconds felt like minutes. And slowly, carefully, the man forced himself to move. Not toward safety. Not away. But along the edge of the rocks, keeping low, keeping silent, using the opening the dog had created, because wasting it would mean everything the dog had risked would be for nothing, and even as his body screamed in protest, even as his injured leg threatened to collapse beneath him, he pushed forward, one painful step at a time, slipping deeper into the jagged terrain where shadows grew thicker and visibility dropped. Behind him, distant shouts echoed. Closer now. Angrier. And then, a single gunshot cracked through the desert. Sharp. Echoing. Final. The man stopped. Everything inside him went still. For a moment, the world disappeared, the heat, the pain, the mission, all of it fading into a single, crushing silence that pressed down on him harder than anything else had so far, and his breath caught in his throat, as his mind refused to accept what that sound could mean, refused to let the thought fully form. But it was already there. And it wouldn't go away. The dog was out there. Alone. And something had just changed. Something that couldn't be undone. The man clenched his jaw, forcing the surge of emotion back down, forcing himself to think, to move, because stopping now would make it real, would make it final, and he wasn't ready to accept that, not yet, not like this. He moved deeper into the rocks, disappearing into the narrow passages where light barely reached, where the world closed in tight, and the outside became distant, muted, but even there, even surrounded by stone and shadow, the sound echoed in his mind, repeating over and over, louder each time, until it felt like it was coming from inside him instead of the desert. And somewhere far behind him, carried faintly on the wind, came another sound. Not a shout. Not an engine. Something weaker. Broken. A sound he knew better than anything else. And it wasn't gone. Not yet. The sound didn't come again right away, and that silence was worse than anything he had heard so far, worse than the gunshot, worse than the shouting, because it left room for doubt, and doubt in a place like this could destroy a man faster than any bullet ever could, but he refused to let it settle, refused to let the possibility take root, and instead, he forced himself to focus on what he knew, on what the dog was, on what they had been through together, because that animal had survived. Things most trained soldiers wouldn't have walked away from, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and the exhaustion, something told him this wasn't over yet. He pressed forward through the narrow rock passage, his shoulders scraping against rough stone, each movement careful, controlled, but slower now as the terrain tightened around him, turning the open desert into a maze of jagged edges and blind corners, and the air here felt different, still hot but heavier, trapped between the rock walls with no wind to carry it away, making every breath feel thick and suffocating, and his legs screamed with every step, the damage becoming more obvious as time passed, as strength drained away, but he didn't stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant hearing that shot again. Another sound reached him. Faint. Closer than before. A low, uneven exhale that cut through the silence like something struggling to exist. He froze instantly, his entire body locking into place as he turned his head slightly, listening, isolating the direction, filtering out everything else until there was nothing but that fragile, broken rhythm, and without hesitation, he shifted course, moving toward it, deeper into the rock formation where the shadows swallowed light, and the path narrowed into something barely passable. Every step now felt heavier. Not just from injury, but from something else building inside him, something sharp and urgent that pushed past the exhaustion, past the pain, something that felt dangerously close to hope, and he hated it, because hope could break a man faster than fear when it turned out to be wrong, but still, he followed the sound. The passage opened suddenly into a shallow hollow between the rocks, a pocket of shadow hidden from the outside, and for a split second, His eyes struggled to adjust to the change in light, but then he saw it. A shape on the ground. Still. Too still. His breath caught as he stumbled forward, dropping to one knee despite the pain that shot through his leg, his hands reaching out before his mind could catch up. And then he was there, close enough to see, close enough to know. The German shepherd lay partially on his side, his chest rising unevenly, his breathing shallow, labored, each inhale delayed as if it had to fight its way back into his body, and there, just behind the shoulder, dark against his fur, was the wound, blood-soaked deep, spreading slowly, too slowly, and that was the worst part, because it meant it wasn't fresh. It meant he had been lying here like this for some time, alone. The man's vision blurred for a second, something tightening in his chest so suddenly it felt like it might crush him from the inside. But he forced it back, forced everything back, because this wasn't the moment to break, this was the moment to act. "Stay," he whispered, though the word came out rough, barely more than breath. The dog's eyes opened slightly. Just enough. And in that small, fragile movement, there was recognition. Not confusion. Not fear. Recognition. And something else. Relief. The man swallowed hard, his hands already moving, pressing gently around the wound, assessing, calculating, his training cutting through the emotional surge like a blade, because if he let himself feel right now, even for a second, he would lose the time they didn't have, and time was everything. The bullet hadn't passed through. It was still inside. That was bad. But not impossible. Not yet. He tore a strip from what was left of his uniform, ignoring the protest of fabric, ignoring the tremor in his hands, and pressed it firmly against the wound, applying pressure, steady, controlled, even as the dog flinched slightly, a low sound escaping his throat. But he didn't pull away, didn't snap, didn't resist. He stayed, trusting, even in pain, even now. "Not now," the man muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the dog, forcing focus, forcing clarity. "You don't get to stop now." The dog's breathing hitched again. Weaker. The man looked around quickly, scanning the hollow, the rocks, the ground, searching for anything that could help, anything that could give them even the smallest advantage, but there was nothing, no supplies, no backup, no safe place, just heat, stone, and the growing reality that if they stayed here too long, they would both be found. He had to move him. But the dog couldn't walk. Not like this. The man exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then slid his arms carefully beneath the dog's body, adjusting his grip to avoid the wound as much as possible, and as he lifted, pain shot through his legs so violently that his vision went white for a split second, his body nearly giving out beneath the combined weight, but he locked his jaw, forced himself upright, refusing to collapse, refusing to fail now. The dog didn't struggle, didn't make a sound. He just rested there, his head low against the man's arm, his breathing uneven but present, and that alone was enough to keep him moving. Step by step. Slow. Painful. But forward. The hollow no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a trap. And somewhere beyond the rocks, faint but growing, the voices had started again, sharper now, closer than before, spreading through the desert like something searching with purpose, something that had realized it had missed something the first time. The man tightened his grip slightly, adjusting the dog's weight, ignoring the burn in his muscles, the instability in his leg, because none of that mattered anymore, none of it compared to the simple, undeniable truth pressing down on him now. Hours ago, the dog had saved his life. Now, it was his turn. And failure wasn't an option. Not this time. The weight of the dog pressed against his arms like something far heavier than flesh and bone, not because of size, but because of what he carried with him now. A responsibility that went beyond survival, beyond orders, something that felt deeply personal, and every step forward became a silent promise he refused to break, even as his injured leg trembled violently beneath him, threatening to collapse at any moment, even as the heat wrapped around him tighter, draining what little strength he had left. But he didn't slow down, couldn't slow down, because the voices behind him were getting closer, spreading through the rocks with increasing urgency, and every echo against the stone walls reminded him that time was slipping away faster than his body could keep up. The narrow path twisted unpredictably, forcing him to turn sideways at times, his shoulders scraping against rough edges as he maneuvered through the jagged terrain, careful not to jolt the dog too much, careful not to worsen the wound that already looked dangerously deep, and with each movement, he could feel the dog's breathing shift slightly, uneven, fragile, like something barely holding on, and that sound alone kept him moving, kept him pushing forward when everything inside him screamed to stop, to rest, to give in. A gust of wind slipped through the rocks ahead, cooler than the air behind him, subtle but noticeable, and instinctively he followed it, because in a place like this, any change in the air meant something, and as he pushed through another tight passage, the space suddenly opened again, revealing a shallow decline that led down into a narrow canyon carved into the desert floor, hidden from the open terrain, shielded from direct view. And for the first time since the explosion, something close to opportunity flickered in his mind. Cover. Real cover. Not just shadows, not just temporary concealment, but something that could actually hide them, something that could buy time. He didn't hesitate. Carefully, slowly, he began descending into the canyon, his footing unstable, the loose sand shifting beneath his boots, forcing him to adjust his balance constantly, and the added weight of the dog made every movement more dangerous, more precise, but he managed, step by painful step, until finally he reached the bottom, where the temperature dropped slightly, where the sunlight didn't hit as directly, where the world above felt just a little farther away. He lowered the dog gently onto the ground, kneeling beside him despite the sharp protest from his leg, and immediately his hands went back to work, checking the wound again, pressing firmly to control the bleeding. But this time it was worse, the blood darker now, thicker, and the dog's breathing had become slower, more spaced out, and a cold realization settled in his chest that if he didn't act soon, if he didn't do something more than just stop the bleeding, this wouldn't hold. He looked around quickly. The canyon walls were rough, uneven, with small ledges and cracks scattered throughout, and near the edge, partially buried beneath sand and debris, something caught his eye, something that didn't belong to nature. Straight lines, metal, worn and half-hidden, and he pushed himself up, limping toward it. His movements rushed now despite the risk, because instinct told him this might be more than just debris. He dropped beside it, brushing away sand with his hands, uncovering what looked like the remains of an old supply crate, rusted, damaged, likely abandoned long ago, maybe from a previous operation, maybe something forgotten by time, but right now, it didn't matter where it came from, only what was inside. He forced it open. The lid resisted at first, stuck from years of neglect, but with a sharp pull, it gave way, the metal groaning as it shifted, and inside, scattered and disorganized, were remnants of something that felt almost unreal in this moment. Bandages. Old, but usable. A half-empty water container. A small medical kit, worn but intact. For a second, he just stared at it, as if his mind couldn't process the sudden shift from nothing to something, from hopeless to a chance however small, and then he snapped back into motion, grabbing what he could, moving as fast as his body allowed. Back at the dog's side, he worked quickly but carefully, cleaning the wound as best as he could with limited water, ignoring the way his hands shook, ignoring the heat, the pain, everything except the task in front of him. And when the dog flinched slightly, a weak sound escaping him, the man paused just for a second, his hand resting gently against his side. "I've got you," he said quietly, the words rough but steady, not just reassurance, but a promise he intended to keep. He wrapped the bandage tightly, securing it in place, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, knowing it wasn't perfect, knowing it wasn't enough, but it was something, and right now, something was all they had. The dog's breathing steadied slightly. Not normal, but better. And that was enough. For now. The man leaned back for a brief moment, his body finally demanding acknowledgement, exhaustion crashing into him all at once, his muscles trembling, his vision narrowing slightly as dehydration began to take hold, but he forced himself to stay conscious, forced his eyes open, because rest wasn't safety, not yet. Above them, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of movement again. Boots. Closer. Not scattered this time. Focused. They had tracked them. The man's grip tightened instinctively, his gaze snapping toward the canyon entrance, his mind already shifting from survival to defense, from escape to confrontation, because running wasn't an option anymore, not with the dog in this condition, not with his own body barely holding together. He looked down at the German shepherd. The dog's eyes were half open, weak but aware, still watching, still present, and even now, even in this state, there was something unbroken in him, something that refused to give in, and that alone was enough to steel the man's resolve. The desert had tried to take him. The enemy had tried to finish it. But this wasn't where it ended. Not for him. Not for the dog. And as the shadows at the canyon entrance shifted slightly, signaling movement just beyond the edge of sight, the man reached for what little remained of his strength, preparing for what came next. Because this time, there would be no running. Only survival. The moment the shadows stretched across the canyon entrance, everything inside him sharpened into a single, focused edge, pain pushed aside, exhaustion buried deep, leaving only instinct and a quiet, controlled determination that settled into his bones, and he shifted slightly, positioning himself between the dog and the opening, not out of training, not out of protocol, but out of something far more instinctive. Something that didn't need orders to exist, because at this point the mission was gone, the objective meaningless, and all that remained was one simple truth that echoed louder than anything else in his mind. He wasn't letting anything take the dog from him. The voices grew clearer now, no longer distant, no longer scattered, but close enough that individual words started to separate from the noise, sharp and deliberate, communicating with precision as they moved through the terrain, and he could picture them without even seeing them, weapons raised, eyes scanning, closing in with the kind of patience that only came from certainty. And that certainty meant they were close enough to finish what they had started. He scanned the canyon quickly, forcing himself to think beyond the immediate danger, beyond the instinct to fight, because charging blindly would end this faster than anything else, and he needed something more, something that could shift the balance even slightly in their favor, and his eyes landed on the crate again, half open, its contents scattered but not useless, and in that moment, a fragile idea began to take shape. Not escape. Not exactly, but a chance. He moved as quietly as he could, ignoring the protest of his leg as he reached back toward the crate, his movements controlled, deliberate, every sound measured against the approaching footsteps, and his hands found what he was looking for buried beneath the remaining supplies, a small, worn signaling flare, old but intact, something meant for rescue, something meant to be seen, and slowly, carefully, he closed his fingers around it, his mind already turning it into something else. The footsteps stopped. Right outside. Silence fell again, thick and heavy, and for a moment, the entire canyon seemed to freeze, as if both sides were waiting, listening, trying to feel the presence of the other without revealing themselves, and the man's breath slowed even further, barely noticeable now, his grip tightening on the flare as he angled his body slightly, preparing for the only move he had left. A shadow crossed the entrance. Then another. They were here. Closer than ever. A single step forward would expose them completely. And that's when the dog moved. It wasn't sudden, not frantic, but deliberate, his head lifting slightly despite the pain, his eyes focusing toward the entrance, and even in his weakened state, there was something in that movement that felt intentional, like he understood exactly what was happening, like he knew what was coming next, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, and in that moment, something passed between them that didn't need language, didn't need explanation, something that felt like agreement. The man nodded almost imperceptibly. Then everything happened at once. He struck the flare. A burst of violent light exploded into the canyon, blinding, intense, filling the confined space with sudden brightness that shattered the shadows completely, and without hesitation, he hurled it toward the entrance, the flare spinning through the air, leaving a trail of fire behind it as it landed just beyond the opening, flooding the outside with light and chaos. Shouts erupted instantly. Confusion. Disorientation. The sudden brightness breaking their vision, their formation, turning certainty into hesitation, and in that split second of disruption, the man moved, not toward them, but sideways, deeper into the canyon's narrower path that branched off behind them, a route he had barely noticed before, hidden by shadow and angle, and he grabbed the dog again, lifting him with everything he had left, ignoring the sharp, tearing pain that surged through his leg as he forced his body forward. Behind them, the chaos grew louder. Voices shouting over each other. Commands overlapping. But no immediate pursuit. Not yet. The light had bought them seconds. Maybe more. And that was enough. He pushed deeper into the narrow passage, the walls closing in tighter, the air growing heavier again, but this time there was something else mixed into it. A faint shift, a cooler current that moved against the heat, subtle but present, and instinct told him it meant something, something important. The path twisted sharply, forcing him to turn sideways again, the dog's weight pressing harder against him now, his strength fading faster with each step, but still he didn't stop, because stopping meant losing the distance they had just gained, and distance was the only thing keeping them alive. The passage widened slightly ahead, and then it opened. Not into another canyon, but into something unexpected. A deeper cut in the earth, almost hidden entirely from above, where the rock dropped suddenly into a shaded hollow that felt separate from the desert entirely, cooler, darker, and for a moment, almost quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. He stumbled forward, lowering himself and the dog down carefully, his body finally giving in to the strain as he dropped to one knee, his breathing ragged now, uncontrolled, his vision narrowing at the edges as exhaustion caught up with him all at once. But he didn't collapse. Not yet. Because something felt wrong. Not danger. Not exactly, but different. The air here didn't move the same. The silence wasn't empty. It felt contained. The dog stirred slightly in his arms. A weak movement, but deliberate. And then his head turned. Not toward the entrance. Not toward the threat. But toward the deeper darkness at the far end of the hollow. And the man followed his gaze slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, focusing, searching, until the shape began to form. A structure. Not natural. Buried partially into the rock. Old. Hidden. And suddenly, the desert didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it had been hiding something all along. And now, they had just found it. The shape didn't make sense at first, not in a place like this where everything was supposed to be raw and untouched, carved only by wind and time. But as his eyes adjusted further to the dim light, the lines became clearer, edges too straight to be natural, surfaces too uniform to belong to the desert, and what he was looking at slowly revealed itself as something man-made, something old, partially swallowed by the earth, as if the desert had tried to erase it and failed. And for a brief moment, even with danger closing in behind them, even with his body barely holding together, curiosity pushed through the exhaustion like a spark that refused to die. He shifted slightly, lowering the dog carefully onto the cooler ground, his hands lingering for a second longer than necessary, as if making sure he was still there, still breathing, and the dog responded with the faintest movement, a shallow exhale, weak but steady, and that was enough for him to stand again, to turn his focus toward the structure, because if there was even the smallest chance this place could offer shelter, could offer something more than the open canyon behind them, they had to take it. The entrance was narrow, partially blocked by collapsed rock and years of sand buildup, but not completely sealed. Just enough of a gap remained to slip through if he angled his body right, and as he moved closer, a faint draft brushed against his face, cooler, stale, carrying with it a scent that didn't belong to the desert, something closed off, something untouched for a very long time. An instinct told him this place had been here long before their mission, long before any of this had begun. Behind him, distant voices echoed again, louder now, sharper, cutting through the canyon as the confusion from the flare began to settle, and that sound snapped his hesitation instantly, replacing curiosity with urgency, and without wasting another second, he turned back, lifting the dog once more with careful precision, ignoring the way his muscles screamed in protest, ignoring the instability in his leg as he forced himself toward the narrow opening. The passage scraped against his shoulders as he pushed through, the rock tight, unforgiving, forcing him to move slowly, carefully, making every second feel stretched and dangerous. But then suddenly, the pressure released, and he stumbled forward into darkness. Real darkness. Not shadow. Not dim light. But something deeper, thicker, swallowing the outside world entirely. For a moment, he couldn't see anything at all, his vision overwhelmed, his body reacting instinctively as he lowered himself and the dog to the ground again, his breathing heavy, echoing slightly against unseen walls, and the temperature here was different, cooler, still warm but no longer suffocating, and that alone felt like a small victory. He blinked hard, forcing his eyes to adjust, shapes slowly beginning to form in the darkness, faint outlines of walls, uneven but structured, a ceiling low but stable, and as clarity returned inch by inch, the realization settled in fully. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a bunker. Old, abandoned, but intact. The dog stirred again, a weak shift of his head, his ears twitching slightly as if reacting to something the man couldn't yet sense, and that movement pulled his attention back instantly, grounding him, reminding him that none of this mattered if he didn't keep him alive, and he dropped beside him again, checking the bandage quickly, pressing gently to feel for warmth, for bleeding, for any sign that things were getting worse. Still breathing. Still holding on. But barely. The man exhaled slowly, his hand resting briefly against the dog's neck, feeling the faint pulse beneath the fur, steady but weak, and something tightened in his chest again, not panic this time, but something heavier, something that felt dangerously close to fear. He pushed it down. Not now. He needed to secure the space. He forced himself up again, moving deeper into the bunker, his steps cautious despite the urgency, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, because a place like this, hidden and untouched, could hold anything, danger, traps, something worse than what waited outside. But as he moved further in, nothing jumped out at him, no immediate threat, just emptiness, silence, and the faint remnants of something long forgotten. Old crates lined one wall, broken, scattered, their contents long gone or reduced to dust. A rusted metal table stood crooked in the corner, and along the far side, partially hidden by shadow, a narrow doorway led even deeper into the structure, disappearing into darkness that felt heavier than the rest, and something about that doorway pulled at him, not out of curiosity this time, but instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive this long. But before he could move toward it, a sound broke through everything. From outside, closer than before. Voices. At the entrance. They had found the opening. The man's entire body went still, every muscle tightening at once as he turned his head sharply toward the narrow gap they had just come through, his breathing slowing again, controlled, silent, and for a moment, everything balanced on the edge of what came next. Then the dog made a sound. Soft, weak, but enough. A small, involuntary exhale that carried through the stillness of the bunker, barely audible, but in a place like this, with sound trapped and echoing against the walls, it might as well have been a shout. The voices outside paused. Silence followed. Heavy. Listening. The man's heart pounded louder now, each beat echoing in his ears as he realized what had just happened, how fragile their position truly was, and slowly, carefully, he reached for the closest piece of debris, pulling it quietly toward the entrance, trying to create even the smallest barrier, even the slightest obstruction that might buy them time. A shadow moved across the gap. Then another. They were right there. And then a beam of light cut through the darkness, slicing into the bunker as someone outside aimed a flashlight through the opening, the narrow ray sweeping slowly across the interior, searching, probing, inch by inch. The man froze completely. Didn't breathe. Didn't move. The light passed over the wall, the floor, the broken crates, getting closer, closer. And then it reached the dog. The beam of light stopped the moment it touched the dog, holding there for just a fraction too long, long enough for everything inside him to tighten into something cold and final, and in that frozen second the world narrowed down to a single point, the faint rise and fall of the dog's chest under that harsh white glare, the dust particles floating in the air like they had been caught in time, and the distant hum of his own heartbeat pounding so loudly it felt like it might give them away. Before anything else could, but he didn't move, not even a breath, because any reaction now would confirm what the light was already beginning to suspect. A voice came from outside, low and sharp, cutting through the stillness, questioning, uncertain but alert, and the light shifted slightly, narrowing, focusing more deliberately, and then another voice answered, calmer, more controlled, dismissive but cautious, as if weighing whether what they were seeing was worth stepping inside for, and that hesitation became the only thing standing between life and the end. The dog's chest rose again. Shallow. Barely visible. But visible. And the man felt something inside him break through the fear, something harder, something that didn't allow him to stay still any longer, because if they stepped inside, if even one of them crossed that threshold, there would be no more hiding, no more waiting, just a fight he couldn't win in this condition, and without thinking, without giving himself time to doubt, he acted. His hand closed around a loose piece of metal near his side, cold and rough, and with a single controlled motion, he threw it deeper into the bunker, toward the far wall beyond the narrow doorway, the sound sharp and sudden as it struck stone and echoed through the structure, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the exact source. The reaction was instant. The light snapped away from the dog, jerking toward the direction of the noise, and the voices outside shifted again, urgency replacing uncertainty, commands being exchanged quickly as their attention pulled deeper into the bunker instead of the entrance, and that single moment of redirection opened a gap so small it almost didn't exist, but it was enough. The man moved. Fast, silent, decisive. He reached for the dog, lifting him again despite the agony that tore through his leg, his body screaming in protest, but he forced it down, forced everything down, because there was no other option now, no second chance if he hesitated, and without looking back, he turned toward the deeper doorway at the far end of the bunker, disappearing into the darkness just as the beam of light swept back across the entrance. Behind him, footsteps. Closer. Inside now. The enemy had crossed the threshold. The deeper passage swallowed him completely, the darkness thicker here, the air colder, heavier, and the space narrower, forcing him to move carefully even as urgency pushed him forward, and every sound behind him felt amplified, boots against the ground, faint echoes bouncing through the bunker as the search began in earnest, methodical, thorough, and closing in. The dog stirred slightly in his arms. A weak movement. A reminder. Still here. Still alive. The man adjusted his grip, tightening it just enough to keep him secure without causing more pain, his breath controlled despite the strain, and he pushed deeper, step by step, until the passage opened again into a lower chamber, smaller, more confined, but completely cut off from the entrance by a turn in the rock that blocked direct line of sight. He lowered the dog carefully, his movement slower now as his strength began to fade again, his muscles trembling uncontrollably from overuse and dehydration, but he forced himself to stay focused, forcing his eyes to scan the space quickly, searching for anything, any advantage, any way to stay hidden just a little longer. The chamber was nearly empty. Bare rock. Dust. And then, along the far wall, partially concealed beneath debris, something caught his attention. A metal hatch. Flat against the ground. Old. Worn. But intact. His mind snapped to it instantly, instinct recognizing what it could be before logic even had time to catch up, and he moved toward it, dropping to one knee, his fingers brushing away the layer of sand and dirt that had built up over it, revealing the edges more clearly, the outline of something that hadn't been touched in years. Behind him, voices echoed again. Closer now. Moving deeper into the bunker. Searching room by room. Systematic. He gripped the edge of the hatch, testing it, and for a second it didn't move, stuck from time and neglect, and his jaw tightened as he shifted his weight, applying more force, ignoring the pain in his leg as he pulled again, harder this time, and suddenly it gave, the seal breaking with a low, grinding sound that felt far too loud in the confined space. He froze, listening. The voices paused, for just a second, then continued. They hadn't pinpointed it. Not yet. He pulled the hatch open fully, revealing a narrow descent below, a ladder disappearing into darkness even deeper than the bunker above, and a faint current of cool air rose from it, carrying with it the scent of something old, something untouched, but also something else. Something safe. Or at least safer than here. He turned back to the dog, his chest tightening again as he looked at him, the rise and fall of his breathing slower now, weaker than before, and time suddenly felt like it was collapsing in on itself, slipping faster with every passing second. "This is it," he whispered, barely audible, not expecting a response but needing to say it anyway. The dog's eyes opened slightly. Just enough. And that was all he needed. He lifted him again, positioning him carefully, and without hesitation, he stepped onto the ladder, beginning the descent into the unknown below just as a beam of light sliced into the chamber behind him. And for the first time since the mission began, the desert was no longer the greatest threat. What waited below was something else entirely. Part 9 note right in paragraph no heading no space in line. The ladder creaked under his weight as he descended, each step slow and controlled, the metal cold against his hands, damp in a way that didn't belong to the desert above, and with every rung he moved down, the sounds from the bunker above became more distant, more muffled, until they faded into something barely recognizable, replaced instead by a silence that felt deeper, heavier, like the air itself had been sealed away for years, untouched and waiting, and when his boots finally touched the ground below, the shift was immediate, the temperature cooler, the air thicker, carrying a faint metallic scent that lingered at the back of his throat. He stepped off the ladder carefully, turning slightly as his eyes struggled to adjust to the near-total darkness, and for a moment, he could see nothing at all, only shadows layered over shadows, until slowly, faint shapes began to emerge, outlines forming in the dim light filtering down from above, revealing a narrow underground corridor that stretched ahead into darkness, its walls reinforced with old metal plating, rusted in places but still holding, and the realization settled in quickly. This wasn't just a bunker, it was something larger, something built to last, something meant to stay hidden. He lowered the dog gently onto the ground, his movements slower now, more deliberate as fatigue crept deeper into his body, his strength fading in uneven waves, but he forced himself to stay focused, dropping beside him, checking the bandage again, his fingers pressing lightly, feeling for warmth, for blood, for any sign that things had worsened during the descent, and the truth was there immediately. The bleeding hadn't stopped. It had slowed, but not enough, and the dog's breathing had become even more fragile, spaced out, each inhale taking longer to come. "No!" he muttered under his breath, shaking his head slightly as if refusing the reality in front of him, and his hands moved quickly again, tightening the bandage, adjusting the pressure, doing everything he could with what little he had, but deep down, he knew this wasn't something he could fix with scraps and field training, not alone, not here. The dog's eyes flickered open again, weaker this time, barely holding focus, but still aware, still searching, and when they locked onto him, something passed between them again, something quiet but powerful, something that said more than any words could, and he felt it hit him harder than anything else so far. Not fear, not pain, but a kind of weight that settled deep in his chest. "You're not done," he whispered, his voice rough but steady, his hand resting briefly against the side of the dog's neck, feeling the faint pulse beneath his fingers. "Not yet." A faint sound echoed from the corridor ahead. Soft, almost unnoticeable, but not natural. He froze instantly, his head turning toward the darkness, his body going still as every sense sharpened again despite the exhaustion, and for a second, nothing followed, just silence pressing in from every direction, until slowly, something shifted, a faint scraping sound, like metal against stone, distant but real. This place wasn't empty. The thought settled in quietly, without panic, without hesitation, just a fact that needed to be understood, and he forced himself to stand again, his leg nearly giving out beneath him before he caught himself against the wall, steadying his breath, pushing past the weakness, because whatever this place was, whatever had been left behind here, it might be the only chance they had now. He looked down at the dog again. Still breathing. Still holding on. But fading. He couldn't leave him. Not even for a second. So he made a decision. He slid his arms beneath him again, lifting him carefully despite the strain, his muscles protesting harder than before, his grip less stable now as exhaustion took its toll, but he adjusted, locking his arms tighter, securing him as best as he could, and then he turned toward the corridor, toward the unknown. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, the ground uneven beneath his boots, the air growing colder as he moved deeper, and the darkness swallowed everything beyond a few feet ahead, forcing him to rely on instinct more than sight, his movements slow, cautious, listening as much as he was looking, and that faint sound came again, clearer this time, a dragging noise, irregular, followed by something like a low mechanical hum that shouldn't exist in a place abandoned this long. The corridor bent slightly to the right, the wall curving just enough to block the view ahead, and as he approached the turn, his body tensed again, every instinct preparing for something he couldn't yet see, something waiting just beyond that corner, and he paused for a second, his breathing controlled, his grip tightening slightly around the dog. Then he stepped forward, and what he saw stopped him completely. Dim emergency lights flickered weakly along the far wall, barely functional but still alive, casting a faint red glow across a larger chamber that opened up beyond the corridor, and in that chamber, scattered across the floor, were remnants of something that told a story without needing words. Broken equipment, overturned tables, markings on the walls that had faded with time, and in the center of it all, a structure intact, powered, humming softly, as if it had never stopped running. A sealed unit. Medical. Old, but operational. The realization hit instantly, sharp and undeniable, and something inside him surged forward with it. Not hope exactly, but something close enough to push him into motion again, and he moved toward it without hesitation, his steps faster now despite the pain, despite the weakness, because this was the first real chance they had seen since the explosion, the first sign that survival might still be possible. He reached the unit, his hands moving over its surface, searching for controls, for anything that still worked, and as his fingers pressed against the panel, the system responded, faint lights flickering to life, the hum deepening slightly, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The voices above, the desert, the danger, all of it. Because right here, right now, there was only one thing that mattered: keeping him alive. He looked down at the dog, his chest rising slowly, unevenly, his body still, fragile, and without wasting another second, he began to prepare, his movements focused, precise, driven by something stronger than training alone. But behind him, far down the corridor they had just come through, something shifted again. Not the enemy. Not Boots. Something else. Something that didn't belong to the mission. And it was getting closer. The sound behind him didn't echo like footsteps from above, didn't carry the same weight or rhythm. It was irregular, uneven, something dragging slowly across the floor, and as the faint red lights flickered again, stretching long shadows across the chamber, a quiet realization settled in that whatever existed down here had been here long before they arrived, and it hadn't left, and for a brief moment, instinct pulled his attention backward, telling him to turn, to face whatever was approaching. But then he looked down at the dog again, at the fragile rise and fall of his chest, at the life that was slipping away second by second, and that decision became simple, immediate, and absolute. Nothing mattered more than him. He moved faster now, his hands working over the medical unit with urgency, brushing away dust, forcing open compartments that resisted at first before giving in with a low mechanical click, and inside, against all logic, against all expectations of a place abandoned this long, there were still supplies, sealed, preserved, untouched, and his mind snapped into motion, training taking over completely as he grabbed what he needed. Sterile wraps, injection tools, anything that could stabilize the wound enough to buy time, enough to stop the bleeding that was slowly taking everything from him. "I'm not losing you," he said under his breath, the words rough, barely controlled, but filled with a weight that came from somewhere deeper than the moment itself, and carefully, steadily, he began to work, cleaning the wound again with what little antiseptic remained, the dog flinching weakly, a small sound escaping him, but still not pulling away, still trusting, even now, and that trust hit harder than anything else, pushing him forward, keeping his hands steady even as his own strength began to falter. The sound behind him came again. Closer. Louder. That dragging scrape followed by a low mechanical pulse, like something broken, but still moving, and this time, he couldn't ignore it completely, his head turning slightly, his eyes scanning the edge of the chamber where darkness swallowed everything beyond the red glow, and for a split second, he thought he saw movement, a shape shifting just beyond the light, but then it was gone, leaving only the sound behind. He turned back instantly. Focused. Because fear wouldn't save them. Action might. He injected what he could, applying pressure again, tightening the wrap with precision, his movements efficient despite the tremor in his hands, and slowly, gradually, the dog's breathing changed, still weak, still fragile, but less erratic, less desperate, and that small shift was enough to anchor him, enough to remind him why he was still fighting, why he hadn't given up yet. "You hear me?" he whispered, leaning closer for just a second, his hand resting gently against the dog's head. "You're not done, not here." The dog's eyes opened again. Barely, but they focused. And in that moment, something returned, something faint but unmistakable, awareness, presence, a spark that hadn't gone out yet, and the man exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to feel like relief. But it didn't last, because the sound was right behind him now. He turned fully this time, slowly, deliberately, and the shape stepped into the red light. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. The remains of an old machine, humanoid in structure but broken, parts exposed, wires hanging loose, its movements unsteady, driven by something that had kept it running long after it should have stopped, and for a second, confusion cut through everything, because this didn't belong here. Not in a forgotten bunker beneath a desert battlefield, not in a place like this. It paused, as if assessing, as if recognizing something. Then it moved again. Closer. Dragging one leg behind it, the metallic scrape echoing through the chamber, and the man felt the tension return instantly, his body shifting slightly, positioning himself between it and the dog without even thinking, his instincts snapping back into place despite the exhaustion. He had nothing left. No real weapon. No strength for a prolonged fight. But he stood anyway, because that's what he had left. The machine stepped closer into full view, its faint internal light flickering, unstable, and then something unexpected happened. It stopped again, its head tilting slightly, scanning, processing, and a faint, distorted sound came from it. Not quite words, not quite noise, something in between, something broken but trying. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just held his ground. And then, slowly, the machine shifted direction. Not toward him, not toward the dog, but toward the medical unit. Its movement slower now, more deliberate, and it reached out, one damaged arm extending toward the controls, its fingers twitching as if remembering something, as if following a pattern embedded long ago, and when they made contact, the system responded, lights flickering brighter, the hum deepening, stabilizing. The man watched, still, alert, uncertain, but understanding something was happening, something beyond immediate danger, and the machine continued, activating sequences, adjusting settings with surprising precision despite its broken state, and then it stepped back. The medical unit shifted, panels moved, and a deeper system engaged. Something advanced, something that had been waiting. The man turned back to the dog, his eyes scanning the changes, understanding quickly that whatever this thing had just done had improved their chances, had activated something he wouldn't have been able to access alone. And for the first time since this had all begun, something real, something solid, settled in his chest. Not hope, but possibility. Minutes passed. Long, heavy, but stable. The dog's breathing strengthened slightly. Still weak, but present. Still fighting. And that was enough. Above them, distant and fading, came the sound of engines again, moving away, the search abandoned, the desert reclaiming its silence, and down here, beneath all of it, in a place forgotten by time, two lives held on against everything that had tried to take them. Hours later, when the man finally allowed himself to sit back, his body giving in to exhaustion at last, his hand still resting lightly against the dog, as if afraid to lose contact even for a second, he understood something that hadn't been clear before. Out there, in the open desert, the dog had chosen him. Without hesitation. Without fear. And down here, in the darkness, when everything had been taken from them, when survival had narrowed down to a single fragile thread, he had chosen the dog back. Not because of orders. Not because of duty. But because some bonds don't belong to war. They survive it. They outlive it. And as the faint red lights continued to flicker in the silence, and the dog's breathing steadied just enough to feel like life again, the man closed his eyes for a moment, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in something quieter, something stronger. Relief. Because against all odds, they were both still here,